I never heard about King Leopold II until I saw this.
Belgium's statues of Leopold II have been brought down. He was a king whose actions in modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo are considered crimes against humanity.
Activists demanded that the statues of King Leopold II be taken down. A monarch whose legacy of tyranny and conquest saw the death of 10 to 15 million Africans. The Congo Free State was one of the bloodiest European colonies in Africa, if not the bloodiest. And this king is responsible for one of the most epic crimes against humanity. But his legacy is mostly ignored or conveniently forgotten. I mean, his atrocities were so bad that they scarred generations of Congolese people. Check this out. In an interview with the African press, a man in his 80s is still haunted by the remnants of the dark colonial era of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He said, and I quote, "Mizi Mivuya, my grandfather, was not the only one who had his hands amputated. I was a small child when I saw many people in my Congolese village missing hands who had gotten the same punishment from the Belgian colonial masters for failing to produce enough rubber for export to Europe." He added that after the hands were chopped off, they were placed in baskets for all to see. This was a way to scare the Congolese to work harder, but this was only the beginning. King Leopold II devised a system of terror in which the entire Congolese population was brutalized, kidnapped, murdered, tortured, and raped. The severe atrocities done under his rule led to the deaths of more than 10 million Africans. I mean, he is almost on the same level as Hitler and Stalin. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he was never held criminally accountable for his crimes. This is the true story of the man behind one of the largest mass murders in modern history. I'm going to start this video with the search for rubber. The European rush for Africa was one of the biggest single land grabs in history. The main powers, such as Portugal, France, Britain, Spain, and Germany, colonized the continent relatively fast. It was a bloody business. In 1870, about 10% of Africa was formally under European rule, but by 1914, that number went up to almost 90%. At that time, only Ethiopia and Liberia stayed independent. Colonial rule in the Congo started in the late 19th century. The area was ruled by Belgium from 1908 to 1960. To promote his influence and appear better than the other rulers, King Leopold devised an interesting strategy. He created the International African Society, which helped present the king as a philanthropist, someone willing to bring the natives the benefits of trade, Christianity, and Western civilization. He hid his real plans and agenda behind his humanitarian facade. Europeans praised him for everything he had done against the slave trade by the Arabs in the Congo. He tried to make the savages civilized through religion, but in reality, he used religion to gain more control. He wanted to turn the locals into his personal slaves. For Leopold, this land was full of riches, ready to be exploited, and its people were mere tools to get that. Some of the most valuable resources were diamonds, gold, and copper. However, they took time and money to generate real income, so Leopold decided to use a different strategy: rubber. In 1888, the first bicycle tire was invented. That same year, the automobile tire came into practice. When Leopold ruled Congo, selling tires was big business. This created a huge demand for tires, and considering Congo was filled with equatorial rainforests full of wild rubber, it was ripe for the taking. Western powers, starting with the United States, were the first to give King Leopold their blessings and turned a blind eye to everything he did. Harvesting rubber was hard work. It was painstaking labor that took hours and hours. Leopold devised a terror system in which the natives had to collect rubber or die at the hands of their colonial masters. The women were held as captives and often starved to death, while the men had to collect a certain amount of rubber by the end of the month or face severe consequences. If the rubber quotas were not met, the king commanded his generals to rape native women, cut off the hands and heads of men, whip people to death, starve them, and burn their villages. Countless natives lost their lives, and others were scarred for life. During colonial times, cutting off a person's hand had severe and lasting consequences. That person couldn't keep up with the monthly rubber quotas. Plus, it was hard to do basic tasks like eating and drinking. These people were left to fend for themselves, and in times like these, that proved to be a serious challenge. The closer the amputation was to the torso or chest, the lower the odds of survival. not to mention severe complications, skin infections, and blood loss. Poor nutrition lowered their survival rates, meaning the man who lost a hand was a dead man. This brings me to another part of this video, and that is Leopold's colonial administration. The thing is, Leopold didn't rule Congo the way most people think. He never, not once, set foot in Africa. Oh no, he had lackeys do it for him. Here's how it worked. Even though Congo was governed from Brussels, the main place where things were managed was the city of Boma, a port where they sent out lots of raw materials. The governor-general, who directly represented the king, lived there. The land was split into 14 parts, each looked after by commissioners chosen by the king. They all reported to the governor-general, who reported to the king. These people would act like trading agents and colonial administrators, but their main job was to get as much rubber and ivory as fast as possible. Fear and dread were used to control the locals. Mass murders and mutilations were a common practice. Terrorism and violence were rampant. To protect his hand, Leopold needed white leaders, so he hired European mercenaries. This is how he made his private army of the Force Publique. He had 19,000 mercenaries at his disposal. The officers of this private army were white, while the rest of the soldiers were black. These black people were forced to kill their own kin. They dealt with rebellions, punched the masses, and took part in horrible tortures and killings, all to serve the king's interests and trading companies. Basically, the Free State of the Congo was a huge concentration camp. Because slavery was so widespread, it was easy to create a reliable transport network and export more goods and natural resources from Congo. For many years, the Europeans had no idea what was happening to the Congolese people. This region was difficult to reach. There was no telecommunication system like the one we have today, so there was no way to get the news out. And almost all the people who worked for Leopold were under his control. That means he could control the story as he saw fit. All the atrocities that he carried out were done inland. The rest were done in remote regions, far from the eyes of typical Europeans. Many of the Congolese soldiers were locally recruited. This meant that he could create his very own stories, and no one would have a clue what he did there. I mean, rebellions were expected. Everyone who was enslaved tried to rebel one way or another. But this was another level of crazy. To meet the demand for rubber collection, he would punish the rebellions in more ways than one, and none of these kills would be recorded. It wasn't until much later, during his rule, that diplomats, writers, and missionaries were sent to the region. They documented what happened there and told us about the fate of the natives in Congo. In fact, these were the first in-person testimonies of the true horror stories of everyday life in the country. One such data was collected from the US missionary G.W. Williams and the popular American writer Mark Twain. In these writings, we can see the dark times in the late 1800s. They spoke about the terrible and severe punishments that the Congolese people suffered. These stories were published in newspapers around the world. We know that there was a public outcry shortly after that, but not to the extent most people would imagine. In 1905, after a couple of months of investigation, the commission issued a report that showed the abuses happening in Congo. There was nothing that Leopold could do about it. The public had its own opinion, even in Belgium. But after a couple of diplomatic maneuvers, the king was able to manage everything just the way he wanted. This brings me to another part of the video, which is why King Leopold II was never punished. King Leopold was able to dismiss most of the accusations based on conspiracy theories, baseless slander, and liberal winning. His lawyers did the deed, and for many years, he kept his reputation clean. When he first came to Congo, he presented himself as a selfless humanitarian. This gave him power over people and a treacherous amount of influence among the common folk. He spread Christianity and civilization, and many Europeans admired him for it. One of the most impactful missionaries who reported back to the Europeans and witnessed the brutal horrors of Congo was Alice Seeley Harris. She documented colonial exploitation and violence. But this was a decade after King Leopold set up his regime. She persuaded many locals with severed hands and feet to pose for a picture. This was her photographic campaign to support human rights. These images horrified public opinion in Europe, but Leopold denied all charges. Leopold praised the United States and America, especially President Roosevelt. He described the president as someone who would create a splendid nation. Here's what he said, and I quote, "I am very glad to see a representative of the American press. I have great admiration for most of the newspapers of America. I know most of them try to be honest and straightforward, and usually judge an international question on its merits. Then it is not true that atrocious conditions exist in the Congo region? Of course not. People should credit us with common sense even if they will allow that humanity exists outside their own country. It would be absurd for us to mistreat the blacks because no state prospers unless the population is happy and increasing. America knows, perhaps, better than any other country, how true this is. Theoretically, because he never went to Congo, he was never responsible for any of these things. Many people worked for the king, and they treated the Africans in the most horrible ways imaginable. But that didn't mean Leopold did it. Politics, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. But before we get into it, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It goes a long way in helping our message get pushed to more people. We aren't just telling stories, we're changing lives and waking the culture up. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers had a complex web of colonial ambitions, alliances, and rivalries. King Leopold managed to maintain diplomatic relations with a major portion of European powers. This gave him unprecedented access to the Congo region. He could influence the way people perceived his actions, and many were reluctant to criticize him too harshly because of his colonial endeavors. Even if missionaries did collect evidence, it took a long time for that evidence to reach the public, meaning that the influence the king previously had still remained strong. Then there was the economy. Yes, Leopold exploited the masses, but he also amassed a huge amount of wealth, mainly from the rubber and ivory trade. So, this private venture was a huge source of income for everyone involved, directly or indirectly. Even if people knew about it, they didn't care what he was doing, as long as it brought them money. I mean, it was the perfect timing. Bicycle and automobile industry. Everything was just the way he wanted. So, it was expected that we would deny or downplay the charges. He wanted to protect his reputation as long as he could, so that he would get more money and power out of it. He covered his diabolical brutality with very smart diplomacy. Here's how he used the public diplomacy to avoid getting punished. Leopold came up with the idea of making a Congo Free State, where he would be the sovereign ruler. The name made it sound like people would have freedom. He talked a lot about this in Britain and pointed out that Portugal had slaves to take the attention away from his plans. He said he would get rid of slave traders in the Congo area. He also promised British businesses that if he controlled the Congo, they would get special benefits. He told Germany that they would be treated the same as everyone else. Leopold then told France that his organization would support them in controlling the northern part of the Congo River. He added that if he couldn't afford to run this whole part by himself, he would give it to France. He sent the US president some edited copies of treaties he got from Stanley. He said his group would take care of the Congo and give power to the locals when they were ready. He wanted the US to recognize the treaties and the Congo Free State. He even told Southern politicians it could be a new place for freed black people from the Deep South. He made a lot of promises. In April, the American Congress said the treaties were real and that the Congo was its own country with Leopold as king. Other countries like France and Germany recognized it too, since people saw the organization as a real government. Bismarck invited Leopold to talk with the powerful countries of Europe. In November 1884, there was a meeting called the International Conference. They decided how to split up African lands without asking any African leaders. The Congo Free State featured almost 2,600,000 square kilometers, 1 million square miles, making it the biggest claim in Central Africa. Another reason Leopold wasn't considered a dictator is that he built a lot of urban projects, buildings, and public works in Belgium. He basically made Brussels a Little Paris. These architectural masterpieces were built at the expense of the exploitation of the Congolese people. Leopold made an exhibition on a fancy property to show off how great the Congo Free State and Belgium's progress were. The exhibition had two parts. The first one showcased resources gathered from the Congo, and the second one, in the park, Leopold organized 267 Africans to come to Belgium to set up a traditional village from Congo. This led to the creation of the Congo Museum. Then there was the Cinquantenaire, a U-shaped building that's the highlight of the Belgian capital. The park's centerpiece is the triumphal arch, known as the Arc de Triomphe, which was built to commemorate Belgium's 50th anniversary as an independent nation. Leopold II was also involved in restoring and constructing various churches, public buildings, and urban projects throughout Belgium, particularly in Brussels. To better understand his thoughts and behaviors, it is important to look at how he spoke about the Congolese people. In his mind, it was important to teach these black natives to forget their heroes and adore only Europeans. It was crucial to showcase your dominance and demand respect so that these Congolese would never question your superiority. Basically, no matter how kind they were to you, you shouldn't give them anything in return, other than some common courtesy. To expose how cruel King Leopold II was, Mark Twain wrote a pamphlet in 1905 called King Leopold's Soliloquy. This book was published in 4 languages: English, Italian, French, and German. In the book, Twain used humor to criticize Leopold and his control over the Congo Free State. Twain mainly talked about how King Leopold II believed God chose him to bring Christianity to the Congo. Leopold said he didn't use government money for himself, and he thought only people who didn't believe in him said otherwise. He said his main goal was to spread Christianity in the Congo, and if anyone said bad things about him, it was like they were insulting God. In the book, Mark Twain also talks about the terrible event in 1899, when Leopold sent Zappo Zaps to collect taxes, and many people were brutally murdered. Leopold tried to say that his critics only talked about his taxes on the Congo, but they ignored his efforts to bring Christianity to the region. As you can see, a lot was going on in the Congo region behind closed doors. The story is a horrible chapter about the brutal mistreatment of the Congolese and the impact of colonialism. It needs to be told. These are lives that were lost. By 1908, diplomatic maneuvers and public pressure forced Leopold to surrender the land. But in that time, he managed to scar generations of people. King Leopold was a tyrant, one tyrant who managed to accomplish such atrocities without a government. But he did have the support of business conglomerates and European powers. He had people doing the dirty work for him. This documentary was extremely heartbreaking for us to make, but the truth needed to be told. If you want to learn some more hidden truth, the video on the screen shares exactly that. Click on it, and we'll see you over there.